Heat waves, drought, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, blizzards, bitter cold. Extreme weather has an incredible impact on people across the globe. On Mount Washington, our scientists brave some of the worst weather on the planet to improve our understanding of our warming world. All right, good evening and welcome everyone to Mount Washington Observatory Science in the Mountains lecture series. My name is Brian Fitzgerald and I'm the Director of Education here for the Observatory, and so glad that you can join us this evening. Really excited in just a little bit joining the program here to help us celebrate the 90th anniversary of the Observatory's founding is Library Curator here at the Observatory, Dr. Peter Crane. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's program. For those of you who are not already familiar, Mount Washington Observatory is a nonprofit member-supported organization with a mission to advance the understanding of the forces that create Earth's weather and climate. And the way that we do that is by running our mountaintop weather station and regional mesonet through our weather operations, by conducting research and product testing projects, and through developing and offering innovative educational programs. If you have questions for tonight's speaker and you're joining us on Zoom, please make sure you use the Q&A button. You can find that at the bottom of your toolbar there on Zoom. And throughout the program, we're doing something a little different here tonight. In fact, we asked you, for those of you who registered on Zoom, if you had any thoughts or questions or even memories you have of your interactions, some highlights with your interactions with the observatory over these years. And we've collected quite a few really amazing comments from many of you, so thank you for that. We'll sprinkle in a few of those comments this evening and also make sure to save some time for a Q&A session later on in the program. Dr. Crane has given a presentation tonight that'll be a little bit shorter than normal, just so we can make sure we have lots of time to make sure you can all share out there in all of our interactions with the special place here in the White Mountains and Mount Washington and the experiences we've had with its weather and climate. Alrighty, so if you're joining on Facebook this evening, feel free to share along there too. We won't be able to get to your comments in real time, but we'll definitely be sure to follow up after the program. If you'd like to join us for an upcoming Science in the Mountains program on Zoom and get your questions answered through that, make sure you register over at mountwashington.org/SITM. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and let's launch a few poll questions here. Peter was kind enough to generate some great questions, some good trivia for those of you joining on Zoom. You will see some questions popping up on your screen right now. Question number 1, in the early years of the observatory, which of the following collaborated and cooperated with the observatory? Was it the Mount Washington Summit Auto Road by allowing use of its Summit Stage Office? Was it the Mount Washington Cog Railway by building a long-term home for the observatory? Was it the Appalachian Mountain Club by encouraging the association of its Huts manager, Joe Dodge, with the observatory? Was it Blue Hill Observatory by providing weather instruments and instructions for their use? Or was it all of the above? Second question there, the world record wind of 231 miles per hour that was clocked on April 12th, 1934. Now, was it estimated based on damage to the buildings of the summit? Might it have been higher, but the anemometer blew away? It was determined to be accurate by the U.S. Weather Bureau. It was surpassed by a tornado in Kansas, which whisked away a young girl and her little dog, or has never been exceeded anywhere. And then last but not least, events of December 7th, 1941, a day that'll live in infamy. It led to which of the following occurring on Mount Washington? The closure of the observatory to the public, the requirement to transmit weather data in code, the establishment of a display room that later evolved into the Summit Museum, the installation of anti-aircraft equipment on the summit, or was it A, B, C, but not D? Alrighty, well, looks like several of you are participating right now. I'll give you another 5 to 10 seconds here to get your trivia questions answered, and certainly Dr. Crane will be coming through with some questions here with some answers to these questions in just a little bit. So we'll give it just another 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1, and we will leave it right there and share some responses and some results. Well, for that first question, overwhelmingly 88% of you said all the above. All of these partners helped the observatory in the early years. For the second question, well, there's a bit of a split there. Most of you, though, thought that the 231 mile per hour wind gust was determined to be accurate by the U.S. Weather Bureau. And then last but not least, well, there was a little bit of a split here. Most of you thought A, B, C, and not D, but then quite a few of you thought about, well, weather data needing to be transmitted in code. Interesting. All right, well, we'll get to all of that in just one moment here. In fact, I will introduce our speaker in just a second, just to give you a little taste. Again, I mentioned we got so many wonderful comments, questions, shared memories in advance for those of you who signed up for this program this evening through Zoom. Those of you like Tom sharing the memory that, hey, leading edu-trips on the summit of Mount Washington with the observatory, specifically some of the geology field trips in the valley, were some of the highlights of Tom's academic career. That's so lovely to hear. Dave shared, the observatory has provided me and friends invaluable resources for pursuing our mountain missions and passions. While Bruce said volunteering on top has been a most rewarding and fulfilling opportunity. A lot of really lovely comments here, including those of you who shared some nice thoughts like Sage did about having some virtual engagement during COVID when a lot of programs stopped. Really grateful for those comments and so glad that many of you have found value in these programs as well. So thank you for sharing some of these thoughts. As I mentioned at the end here, we'll certainly make some time to share some more. But in the meantime, without further ado, I'd love to welcome our speaker for this evening, Dr. Peter Crane. Peter, why don't you join on in to the program? And
all righty.
Hey, I can see you. In fact, I can hear you.
That's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, welcome,
thank
Peter.
You, Brian.
We're really excited for your presentation this evening. And without further ado, would you mind, just taking it away?
All righty, I'll take it away. And I want to thank everyone for participating tonight. Quite a few names I recognize. So hello to all of you whom I have met and know. And but otherwise, thanks to everyone for participating tonight. There we go. All righty. So welcome to everyone, and thanks for joining us this evening as we give a brief overview of the first 90 years of the Mount Washington Observatory. Mount Washington we're having a hard time advancing here. Okay, Brian, we do have a little bit of a technical glitch here.
Oh, it's always
it worked fine when we rehearsed.
Yeah, best laid plans. Well, let's see. I'll be there in just a moment through the magic of
there we go.
There we go.
We'll see how this works. Mount Washington, of course, is the highest peak in the Northeast, and it's a remarkable place that has attracted all kinds of attention, starting in 1642 or perhaps earlier, whether in summer when sunshine and relative warmth can be enjoyed from time to time, or in the wintertime when temperatures can drop to near 50 degrees below zero, and winds of hurricane force, heavy icing, and prodigious snows can occur. This extreme weather has long been the object of popular interest and scientific study. Perhaps the first systematic observations of the mountain's weather occurred in 1853, when Nathaniel Noyes of the then new Summit House kept track of the summit conditions from June into September, but that was the effort of just a single summer. More focused monitoring of the mountain's weather commenced in the fall of 1870, when these two men, Dartmouth professor Charles Hitchcock and fellow geologist Joshua Huntington boldly established a weather station at the summit. The weather station was housed in a corner of this new summit depot of the Cog Railway, and that depot had just been built the previous summer. The summit crew braved the mountain's extreme conditions to monitor the weather for science, enduring the harsh elements and also enduring the cramped and often chilly quarters for living and working. But their winter on Mount Washington was a grand success. While the Huntington-Hitchcock expedition was only intended for one winter, their example led to the U.S. Army Signal Service, our nation's first weather service, to follow immediately in their footsteps and to continue weather observations on the summit starting early in 1871. Soldiers such as Gil Lindsley kept watch on the summit and documented its weather year-round until 1887, and in summertime only into 1892. A separate building, the Signal Station, was built for use as a summit weather station in 1874 and provided Spartan quarters for the soldiers and their work. It was abandoned in 1892, and it was destroyed in an accidental fire in 1908. From 1892 to 1932, the summit's remarkable weather continued, but with only transient visitors to witness it, and none to document it for any length of time. But scientific interest in learning more about the mountain's weather was rekindled by these two men, Joe Dodge, manager of the AMC camp at Pinkham Notch, on the left, and on the right, Bob Monahan, who was at that time a student at Dartmouth College. For a few days in December 1926, they stayed at the summit and took weather observations, and the notion of a longer stay was discussed, but its realization would take a few more years and a few more individuals. In 1932, Dodge and Monahan revisited their idea of establishing a longer-term weather station atop Mount Washington. They made it work. They received a grant for the project from the New Hampshire Academy of Science, and that $400 provided essential funding. Partners in the endeavor included radio man Alex McKenzie on the left and electrical engineer Sal Pagliuca on the right. Another key individual in establishing the Weather Observatory was Charles F. Brooks, a Harvard professor of meteorology and director of the Blue Hill Observatory near Boston. He was the founder of the American Meteorological Society, and he took the observatory under his wing. He worked to advance it from its birth to his death in 1958. Among the contributions to the observatory was providing weather equipment and training in its use, an essential for getting the project off on a solid scientific footing. The observatory's first home was the mountaintop stage office of the Mount Washington Summit Road Company, nowadays known as the Auto Road. Road manager Elliot Libby was generous in allowing use of the building, which was enhanced with insulation and other upgrades to make it a more suitable winter living and work quarters for the summit crew. The observatory was established as a project affiliated with the International Polar Year, a worldwide scientific endeavor to learn more about atmospheric and other conditions at high latitudes and also at high altitudes. Weather observations were at the core of the observatory's work, but there were also other research activities, including releasing pilot balloons to study the motion of air currents, forming a part of the program. Public information and education, too, formed a part of the crew's daily efforts. Bob Monahan chronicled that first winter of the observatory in his book, Mount Washington Reoccupied, the re acknowledging the efforts of the mountain's 19th century weather pioneers. The observatory was originally envisioned as a short-term project in its association with the International Polar Year and the less than permanent nature of its staffing and facility arrangements. But that first winter was so successful and full of promise that Dodge, Brooks, and others saw no reason to stop. There was much to learn at the home of the world's worst weather, about the atmosphere, about the young field of radio communication, and about weather instrumentation. And in that field, The mountain's high winds and heavy icing presented a formidable challenge, which the observatory was keen to grapple with. Working with the Mann Instrument Company of Cambridge, Massachusetts, the observers developed a specialized heated anemometer designed to function in exceptionally harsh conditions. And it's a good thing they did. For on April 12, 1934, a remarkable weather event occurred. With the specialized anemometer securely in position atop the station's roof and diligent staff attending carefully to it, a gust of super hurricane force was accurately recorded. As Sal Paliuca noted in the summit logbook, I knew it was a record, 231 miles per hour. Will they believe it? Well, as Charles Marvin of the U.S. Weather Bureau asserted, great confidence is justified in the verity of these results. Not only was that gust fast, it was the fastest ever. A world record wind, the highest ever observed on the planet, right here on Mount Washington. It would remain the world record until a typhoon caused a slightly higher wind speed on an island off Australia in 1996. The wind of 231 miles per hour remains a testament to the harshness of Mount Washington's weather and to the dedication of the observatory's early staff members to document it. The continuing enthusiasm and hard work of Dodge, Brooks, and others, aided by the notoriety of the world record wind, effectively transformed the observatory from a short-term project to a permanent institution. In 1937, a purpose-built home for the observatory was erected on the summit, built by Henry Teague, owner of the Cog Railway, and leased to the observatory. This photo shows the new building under construction, with the Camden Cottage, a winter refuge for climbers and rather cramped home for the observatory for the summers of 1935, 36, and 37 in the foreground. This building was sometimes called the strongest wooden building on Earth, with a framework built of railroad trestle timbers. Originally, a separate 35-foot tower was used to mount the anemometer, but an attached tower was constructed in 1941. It was roomier and much easier to access, especially in harsh conditions. The 1940s were different times for the young observatory. With the onset of World War II, weather information became sensitive information, closing the observatory to visitors and requiring weather data to be transmitted in a secret code. However, a small display room was established where visitors who could not visit the observatory itself were able to learn more about the mountain. The usual pool of employees, young men, was mostly otherwise occupied in the military or related industries. But the work of the observatory continued, as one writer penned, making the observatory of maximum value in a world at war. And the writer who wrote those words, Victor Clark, worked at the observatory. He was then drafted into the US Army, and the Army decided after his training to assign him to work on Mount Washington, where his special knowledge and experience could be of special value. The 1937 building, with its new tower, gave good service even when covered with rime ice, as was so often the case. It has been estimated that during this building's 43-year lifetime, more than 13 million miles of wind swept over it. It was a place for scientific research, for public information, but at its core, a place for weather observation. In the 40s, as was the case with their 19th century forebears, the daily rounds of weather observation formed the framework for the day for the summit crew, and all other activities were built around them, determining the temperature, measuring precipitation, tallying snowfall, determining wind direction and measuring wind speed, and all the associated observations, documentation, reporting, care of instruments, and the like were the core of the observatory's daily work. The period from the mid-1940s to the early 1960s were very active ones at Mount Washington. The ramifications of World War II and the ongoing Cold War led to a remarkable amount of research on the mountain, much of it related to the impact of atmospheric icing on aviation. New structures were erected on the mountain, such as this signal corps facility just above the halfway point on the autoroad, testing remote weather equipment. A large testing facility for jet engines was built on Homestretch along the autoroad just below the summit. And a large barracks was built nearby, a dormitory for workers involved in the military-sponsored research on the mountain. Also, a test apron was established just below the summit to assess icing impact on helicopters. While the observatory was ideally located to be a partner in these enterprises, most of the government contracts went to larger and better connected private for-profit companies. So the observatory was an important but comparatively minor player in this work, and the financial impact on the health of the organization was not as great as one might think. Indeed, in a public reflection on the state of the observatory in 1952, Charles Brooks acknowledged challenges and even crises in funding, so much so that, in his words, it is truly amazing that none of these has closed the observatory. 3 years later, he remarked on some timely gifts to support the organization, and 70 years later, we are still here. The 1960s saw a continuing dedication to the observatory, and even some bolstered efforts in some areas. The news bulletin, which had appeared only irregularly since 1937, was given a new look and a quarterly schedule as a means to better communicate with observatory members and the public about observatory activities. While the unusual demands of working at a remote location had made turnover and staffing commonplace, a period of unusual stability in personnel allowed for the benefits of accrued experience to be enjoyed under the leadership of Director Guy Gosselin. Guy and his summer crew applied an entrepreneurial spirit to foster the work of the observatory and to earn needed income. Among their projects was the creation of the observatory's Summit Museum in 1973, an expansion of the simple display room that had been a part of the organization since the early 1940s. However, the growing interest in public contact did not hamper the core work of weather observation and research, whether that involved using the rotating multi-cylinder to assess rime formation, or assessment of wind power potential and equipment testing on the Formar helicopter test apron, and of course, maintaining the long record of continuous weather observations at the summit. In 1980, the observatory moved into new quarters in the Mount Washington State Park's Sherman Adams building, and the old wooden building was removed from the summit, passing into history. The next year, 1981, a new Summit Museum opened in the Sherman Adams building. And that museum has more recently been reimagined as Extreme Mount Washington, focusing on the mountain's harsh weather and its impact on the natural environment and human activity. Extreme Mount Washington is only one of the experiences available to visitors. Educational programs such as winter overnight edu-trips, which debuted in 1993, allow a full immersion in the mountain's environment and special insights into topics pertinent to its understanding. School and library programs and many virtual programs, such as this one, are among the many educational activities of the observatory. But just as in 1870, just as in 1932, the fundamental focus of the summer crew is the mountain's weather. Today, perhaps more than ever, the value of such a long-term record is important, not only to better comprehend the nature of the atmosphere in the short term, such as to help in forecasting, but to have a better grasp of our planet's climate and how it can change. So the work goes on now, as it has for 90 years, with weather observation and related scientific research forming the nucleus of the observatory's endeavors, whether engaged in basic research as to the nature of atmospheric processes or involved in applied research on our own or in collaboration with others to develop and test new equipment and techniques, as we have done recently for weather equipment on Mount Everest. With the advent of effective digitization, the observatory's long record of weather data has been analyzed by a number of researchers to better understand change in various parameters over time. Another way we share news about the work we do is our member magazine, now called Windswept, which has a history going back to 1937. And of course, the observatory website, mountwashington.org, is a go-to site not only for information about our activities, but for current weather and forecast details for the higher summits of the White Mountains, making it an essential planning tool for outdoor adventurers throughout the region. Mount Washington and its observatory has weathered many a storm over the last 90 years, and both the mountain and the observatory are still going strong. When the clouds clear, we're always looking to the next horizon, envisioning what we might learn and how we might better serve the public in the 90 years to come. That is a brief history of the observatory. It's hard to squeeze 90 years into such a short period of time, but I thank you for participating, and I'll turn it back to Brian for further questions and comments. Take it away, Brian.
Thank you, Peter. I think well said. Yeah, it's hard to squeeze in 90 years in about 20 minutes. And well, that's okay, because we don't have to do it all in just 20 minutes here. We can ask, well, all of you can ask Peter all sorts of historical questions if you'd like. And one way you can do that is by using the Q&A button that you can find down at the bottom of your Zoom screen there. And Peter, when you have a moment, you can stop sharing your screen there, since I'm sure we'd all love to see your smiling face. There it is. And while folks take a minute to ponder what questions they have for Peter, or any memories or reflections you have with your experiences on Mount Washington or with the observatory over the years, certainly feel free to use the Q&A button to submit your questions there. Again, if you're joining on Facebook, we'll follow up with your comments following the program here. And certainly would love to have you join for a Zoom program in the future. As I mentioned, we have a number of really lovely comments that many of you submitted prior to the program here, and I'd love to highlight just a few more, including Diane, who shared that their favorite memory was hiking to the top of Mount Washington on their honeymoon and traveling the auto road during that time. Danielle shared that the regional mesonet, along with the higher summits forecasts, are always helpful for mountain recreation, particularly in the White Mountains of New Hampshire here, and they're grateful for that. Another person sharing with just the letter B for first name here, sharing that my dad, a meteorologist, took us up and visited with the folks working on the summit when I was a kid, and certainly that stood out in their memory. Even Mary sharing what great fun that she had on the summit during her 2 stints as a volunteer helping cook for the crew, including one night where they had gusts of 92 miles per hour and dramatic rime ice growing over 9 inches just overnight on the summit. Lots of wonderful comments. Certainly appreciate that. Thanks to all of you who have shared your comments there. I got a number of great questions that are coming in here through Zoom, and we'll go back and forth sharing a few and asking a few of Peter here and sharing some memories besides. But a question for you, Peter, from Dennis, who's curious. When did the Summit OBS crew become co-ed? When was the first, I guess as the Huts put it, Hutman parentheses F, when did that occur, to your knowledge?
Actually, it was earlier than one might think. Back in the 1950s, there was a woman named Lorna Ridley who worked at the Summit House, but also took some of the observations. So she'd walk across the summit and do a shift or portion thereof. She later went on to work at the Blue Hill Observatory, got her master's at Penn State, and worked for the National Weather Service in Alaska. So it goes back into the 1950s, but I'd say more recently has become a much more regular aspect the summit crew, probably back from the let's see, maybe late 1980s or so.
Excellent. Yeah, and certainly, and not even just from what I understand from the summit perspective, certainly co-ed support prior to that from, maybe even from what I understand, either a guy's home running guy, and I believe his partner is a Betty who,
Betty,
yeah, who
yes.
ran membership from the kitchen table and all those things. So certainly long history of support from all corners. Great question here from James. I don't know if one can answer this, even you, Peter. How many
No.
cats have been part of the mountain history?
Oh, there have been quite a few. In fact, there was a book written called The Mascots of Mount Washington, which looked at some of those cats. Folks who were very discerning might have noticed in that picture of the crew of 4 people from 1932, there also was a cat held by Sal Pagliuca, variously known as Tiki or Blackie or Pinky. The historical record is not clear as to which the cat preferred, but you've had various cats, including, let's see, Strawberry, DFC, known politely as Darn Fool Cat. And of course, more recently, we've had Jasper, Inga, and now, of course, Nimbus. So often, besides being resident mousetraps, they're also companions for the observers up on the summit, and they are now, and they have been back in the 1930s.
Absolutely. And yeah, from a companion perspective, certainly appreciated for those night observers, those long, lonely nights. Nice to have a companion up there. And similarly, I'm trying to find the comment. Certainly lots of folks who love the feline aspect of the observatory as much as many of us do. And if I could find the comment, I'll come back to it. But anyways, many of you sharing comments, your fascination with cats on the summit, certainly. I got a question from Sandy. This might actually be a very difficult one for you, Peter. Sandy wonders, Peter, what was the singular best experience so far in your years at the observatory?
Oh, I would say I would have to give that a lot of thought, because obviously that's asking a big question for a big experience. So it's hard. Off the top of my head, I can't come up with a good answer to that.
I'm going to come back. I'm going to peg you on that one, because I
Well,
think I'd love to
it,
know some notable maybe experiences, some things that stand
okay,
out from your participation over the years.
all right. Well, if I were to think of some of the experiences, of course, they would relate it well to the camaraderie on the summit. And sometimes they were, in terms of notable, not necessarily enjoyable, occasional search and rescue related activities. In terms of the natural world, sunrises and sunsets and aurora certainly can be quite remarkable. So it's hard to come up with the one, or even a small handful of experiences that have to be at the very top of the list.
Like I said, a tough question.
Yes.
Thank you, Sandy. Howie and Tina have a couple questions here about buildings over the years.
Mm-hmm.
Howie's curious. He came in, I think, a bit late to the presentation, but was wanted to know, so the years again for when the observatory was housed in the Summit Stage office. I know this took me kind of a long time to unpack both the seasonal shifts between that and the Camden Cottage for some time and all that. So 1932 to 1937, more or less.
Well, within that time frame. However, it's a little murky as far as the summer of 1935, because there's at least one source that says that the observatory, or the observers, had moved to Camden Cottage for the summer of 35, 36, and 37, moving into the new building in the later in 1937. But I'm not quite certain about that 1935 date. One of the writings of Alex Mackenzie isn't crystal clear on that matter, but that certainly gives relatively few dates to have to research. And it was evident reading through Alex Mackenzie's The Way It Was, which recounts some of his experiences on the summit of the 1930s, that it probably wasn't satisfactory for anyone or, to have to share the stage office and the weather station during the summertime. Obviously, it was very, very generous of the Summit Road Company to allow the observatory to use that building. But after a couple of summers, a decision was made to move into Camden Cottage for the summer, small as it was, and then to the purpose-built observatory in 1937. A word about the Camden Cottage is that that was built in the 1920s by the hotel company as a winter refuge for climbers. And you might think that that was very, very generous of them. Well, to an extent it was, but also they got tired of climbers breaking into the Summit Hotel. So they just built that little cabin, which was of use for many years. And eventually, my understanding is that it was moved and repurposed as a restroom that was kind of sticking out the end of the Summit Hotel. So, and eventually that came down, would have been in 1980 with the Summit House.
Oh,
Thus,
wow.
thus ended its illustrious career.
I didn't realize aspects of, wow, yeah, quite an end there. I didn't realize aspects of the Camden Cottage existed until 1980.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so Tia is also curious about the shape actually of today's observatory house building. They're curious what the significance of the shape is of the current observatory. It looks very different from previous boxy looking buildings up there in the summit. What can you share about that?
Well, my understanding is that, of course, the observatory is within the Sherman Adams Summit building, so it's part of a larger building. And with all due respect, or to give all due respect to the folks who work year-round working for the state park, sometimes people lump all the functions together and just call that building the observatory. So it is a state park building. The observatory leases space within it. And I think the reason for that somewhat crescent shape, or that curve shape there, is more or less to fit in to the side of the mountain a bit. So it's quite prominent as you come up the home stretch on the road looking up, somewhat prominent from the northern peaks, but essentially invisible from the south and until you get very close to the summit from the east. So I think it's mostly just to fit in with the summit of the mountain, to not stick up too much, either in terms of being exposed to the wind or to be visually unattractive.
Certainly for the observers, when you're walking out the instrument door from the tower, it faces largely to the east. You take that for granted until the winds come out of the east, but you could tell that perhaps that was done with some forethought there, that with the prevailing winds from that west and northwest, boy, it's good you don't have a door that's always opening into the wind. And I know the observers are thankful for that.
Brian, there's a tale told about Inga the cat, who was eventually became accustomed to winds from the west and northwest. And when she went out, she would brace herself appropriately so as not to be blown around too badly by that wind. And one day she went out and there was an easterly wind and she went flying because she was totally unaccustomed to that sort of thing. But no harm done.
That's good. Yeah, it's get caught off guard there sometimes.
Yes.
Another question here from Pete, who's curious about Marty Engstrom and his illustrious career on Mount Washington. Curious, how many years, to your knowledge, was Marty up on the mountain, and what was that? I mean, from what you know of his role and sort of his presenting of weather information, though he wasn't actually a staff person from the observatory, from how I understand it.
No, he was one of the station engineers for WMTW TV. I believe he started around 1960 or so, and kept working there till about 2002, 2003, I believe, though I'd have to double check those dates. And as you noted, he was not a staff member of the observatory, but uh, for many years on the evening broadcast on WMTW Channel 8, which had its transmitter on top of Mount Washington, he would get spliced in and offer a live, very brief presentation about the weather. He had, or has, since still lives in North Fryburg, Maine, a very distinctive Maine accent and a very distinctive style of weather presentation. But his principal role there, of course, was to keep the station and its generators operating, because at that time, the only electricity on top of Mount Washington came from the generators that were operated by Channel 8. They had them principally, of course, to use for their generator, but also there was other communications equipment, and also the entire summit operation depended on electricity that was generated and purchased from Channel 8.
Excellent. Yes, and from my understanding, also a nice. I mean, it physically connected the observatory building and WMTW via a maybe inappropriately named breezeway, which I'm sure got quite breezy. But again, from my understanding, because of, physically, but also socially connected those two organizations with, year round folks, the only folks who were up there until the state park was founded, and folks staying year round for the state park as well.
And when I started at the observatory, and I think for a few years thereafter, 1988, there was a tradition of the observatory and the Channel 8 crew having dinner together on Saturday and Sunday nights. Because the Channel 8 crew had to be at their transmitter and generators whenever they were transmitting. They couldn't leave the building. So one night the observatory would bring dinner over, and the other night the Channel 8 crew would provide dinner for the observers at that location. And of course, we called it TV dinner.
Yes, nicely done. What an interesting time it certainly sounded like to work on the summit back then, and have still continues today for those folks who live and work up there, a little mountain community that certainly some close relationships there. A question here from Timothy, actually one that I think I could probably help you out with here, Peter, who gives thanks for such a wonderful presentation. Certainly I echo that. Did I hear you say there were still opportunities to stay overnight at the summit for those who are not weather professionals or researchers? Well, you referenced our overnight EduTrip program, and I could say, as person involved with that program, that yes, by the end of this month, likely we'll have some additional information and some availability regarding the return of EduTrips following our pause during the pandemic. So more information to come. Thanks for your question, Timothy. Peter Anonymous wants to know, how many people are working at the observatory on a daily basis?
Well, it can vary a little bit, but during the summertime, typically there is a museum attendant. Also, generally 3 observers, nominally working 8-hour shifts. On a typical shift, we'll have one who's, well, all of those are observers. One may have an emphasis on meteorological matters, another on computer and engineering matters, and another on public educational matters, because those are the core of what we do. Also, typically we'll have an intern or 2 interns on a shift. Those interns often are college students or recent graduates in meteorology or related sciences. They will help us out with all manner of things, ranging from taking weather observations, so that adds to their on-the-job training, but also just the routine task of maintaining the weather station. And typically the interns will also have a particular focus, a research project to engage in during their stay. And from time to time also, we may have observatory members who serve as volunteers to help us in various capacities, depending on the particular needs at the time and how they match up with the experience and skills of the volunteer candidates.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, for folks who are interested in volunteering, including this winter, our application for winter mountaintop volunteers is live. So do check that out over at mountwashington.org if you do have interest. The question here from John, who's curious, Peter, you had mentioned certainly your involvement and historically the observatory either directly in or indirectly involved in some search and rescue activities. I believe you've been active with ABSAR over the years and other search and rescue groups. Any notable experiences that you can recall from your time involved in supporting search and rescue as either a member of the observatory or in your capacity with ABSAR or elsewhere?
I guess I'll try to focus on the happier stories. One of the more dramatic ones that I was involved in, I suppose, was an incident in Huntington Ravine, where a woman and her partner were climbing up the ravine. Those who might be familiar with the Huntington Ravine Trail understand that it's a very steep trail, essentially rock climbing in some areas. This woman slipped, and she required a technical rescue. I happened to be working at Pinkham Notch at the time, and they also happened to be using a helicopter to fly material to and from the huts at that time. So I got a quick ride up to the Alpine Garden, and I'll confess that as we went up and observed the scene of the accident, I said to myself, this is how people get killed in helicopters. So I was glad to get my feet on the ground in the Alpine Garden, although had a very, very capable pilot of the ship and operator. I had no problem there. And happy to say that made it to the scene also with a state park employee, Mark Holmes, and Mountain Rescue Service was called because it was indeed a need for ropes and technical expertise. And happy to say the woman had a full recovery from what could have been, well, it was a very serious incident that could have had even more serious consequences. So many stories from the mountain, but I guess we'll leave it at that for now.
Yes, well, it's I don't believe it's too common these days for while you are a professional, Peter, perhaps other professionals are usually the ones hopping into helicopters to go save the day now.
Yes, yes.
National Guard and medical personnel, professional medical personnel. That's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
Great question here from Mark, who's curious if the observatory has been involved in the reporting of UFOs over the years. Anything you know about that? Anything you're able to share?
To the best of my knowledge, no. I find that interesting because, because our former director, Guy Goslin, recently had a piece in the Conway Daily Sun addressing this particular matter, not under the aegis of the observatory in any sense, but as he read recent Department of Defense material that has been released to the public, he realized that this could be pretty important. And I think he would underscore that these were unidentified flying objects. And so he did not presume a particular identification. But if you want to take a look for UFOs, Mount Washington is not the best place for it because the summit of the mountain is in the clouds about 2/3 of the time. And it has some cloud cover over the summit, probably another 35 or so % of the time. So you aren't going to be able, you won't be able to see very far into the heavens.
Well, and Timothy's curious about aurora and how frequently that is visible. And I will say, I suppose a similar response you'd give Peter for that, even if aurora or other flying objects were to be visible, it's not to say that you'd be able to see them very frequently or well from the summit. So a bit of a tease for my background photo here. I must confess, it's not often that you have very far visibility just playing the odds there.
Yes. And of course, some of our summit staff, like Ryan Knapp, who is, besides being a great meteorologist, is an excellent photographer, he's been in the right place at the right time and has taken some wonderful pictures of the aurora. And I've never been far north, but I will say that the best aurora that I've seen, I happened to see from Mount Washington, not from the summit, but it was actually down at Hermit Lake in Tuckerman Ravine. That also was quite memorable. So if I was going to say if the stars align, but it's not exactly stars that we're talking about. But if circumstances allow, it can be very dramatic and very impressive.
Absolutely. Well, Peter, just maybe time for a couple more questions here. We have a lot of wonderful questions, and I really grateful for everyone who's participated this evening. Would love to hear more voices if possible tonight. But question here from Nancy, who's curious if there's a database of folks who have worked at the observatory over the years, since obviously quite a few have supported the weather observation and other efforts over these 90 years.
You know, we have some records that relate to that. What was sometimes referred to as the old observers, but as some of those observers reached a certain age, they realized that they really didn't care for that name quite so much. And so some people refer to the former observers group, known in brief as FOG, of which there is a lot of on Mount Washington. I would say we don't really have an active database. We do have records, but one of these days you might actually go through some of our old windsweeps and news bulletins, and perhaps even personnel records, and try to come up with something that's a little more up to date on that.
Yeah, it's been a little while. I know there's been some reunions of observers in the past, and
Yes.
perhaps time for the fog to gather
Yes.
once again.
Yes.
I'm trying to remember what the former intern
Oh.
acronym should be. I felt like we thought of something funny at one time.
Uh,
All right. Well, one last question. Again, thank you to everyone, and apologies if we weren't able to get to your question tonight. By all means, please, if you'd like to have a question responded to that we didn't get to this evening, feel free to email me directly at education@mountwashington.org, and happy to pass that along to Peter. And so, Peter, I'm curious about this because I'm not sure I know the full story always, but Kenneth's curious. How did you get to your position as the observatory curator?
well, I suppose it started on what some might say was an unlucky day. Some unlucky day. It was Friday the 13th of June, 1969. That was my first trip up Mount Washington. And in case this came up, I thought I would get out one of the old logbooks that we happen to have here. And this is the logbook for Friday the 13th of June, 1969. And I didn't even sign in. My brother signed in. I'd clambered up Right Gully from Tuckerman Ravine. He was skiing. I was along for the ride. But somehow Mount Washington and the White Mountains got in my blood. I came up in high school, college, graduate school, and worked. My first job was at the Harvard Mountaineering Club cabin in Huntington Ravine, which some people might know as a hovel, but it was a hovel in a beautiful location. And after one winter there, I worked 10 years for the Appalachian Mountain Club. I worked a summer for the Forest Service, and then started working for the observatory, originally on top of the mountain as an observer, shift supervisor, and museum manager. And then, if you will, got kicked downstairs to oversee the educational programs of the observatory. And with some changes in my life a few years ago, I realized it was time to pass a few batons to some others. And at that time also, the observatory's library and archive needed some more attention. And I was very fortunate that the observatory felt that having a curator working to oversee those aspects of the observatory would be a useful position. So that's how I got here, and here I am.
We're very grateful to have you, and very grateful, Peter, for you presenting this evening and taking the time to do so, and entertain some excellent questions this evening. And on that same note, I wanted to share just a few more comments from what folks sent in, including, we'd be remiss without sharing this because John was kind enough to share this and what he values in the observatory. John mentioned the library in the basement, which I'll correct is now upstairs in our administrative offices here in North Conway Village, curated by our very own Dr. Peter Crane. It's an amazing site, and I hope someday to peruse those shelves. And Peter, what's the best way for people to make an appointment, come in, and make the most of the resources of the library?
Because we're away from a lot of people, in that we're in what might be considered rural part of New Hampshire. Probably the handiest thing is for folks to just send me an email. My email address is pcrane, P-C-R-A-N-E, at mountwashington.org, MOUNTWashington.org. And my usual schedule has me here in the library 2 days a week, but I certainly will be happy to modify that to accommodate requests on a mutually agreeable basis. And happy to, if folks are doing a particular piece of research, or if they just want to have a look at the books and maps and other items that we have here, please get in touch.
Well, and make sure you set aside the proper amount of time for a visit with Peter, because as every staff person knows and every other visitor, you can't just wander into the library and think you're just going to take a quick glimpse in there. It is seriously a wonderful, wonderful collection full of many fascinating and important items. So I'm grateful for you, Peter, for continuing to maintain those records on behalf of the organization and the region here. And so I know we're reaching about the top of the hour. And so, Peter, would like to say thank you again. And thanks to all of you for joining tonight. If you enjoyed tonight's program, please help us celebrate Mount Washington Observatory's 90th anniversary here by supporting programs like these, making a donation, becoming a member over at mountwashington.org, where you can find the donate button in the upper right-hand corner of the screen there. And don't forget that any amount also makes you a member of the observatory, with many benefits here. If you have thoughts for our program tonight or suggestions for future speakers, certainly feel free. We'd encourage you to fill out the survey for the program following the end here. Don't forget to join us next month, Tuesday, November 15th, where we'll have meteorologist Scott Reynolds, who will be presenting on the intersections between weather and aviation safety. So don't forget to register for that program and catch up on any other programs you may have missed over at mountwashington.org/SITM. We'll see you again soon. And one last thing, because this Saturday is our 90th anniversary of our founding, we are going to be hosting an open house in the weather station on the summit. If you can find your way up there, either on foot by the Cog Railway or on the roadway, we will be hosting an open house from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., weather permitting. We'll put out some more information on our social media channels as we get a little closer toward looking at that forecast for the weekend here. But hope to see you there if you're able to make it up to the summit. And thanks again for joining tonight. Thank you, Peter. Have a great night. And thanks to all of you. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.